Hey, for the last several weeks, we've been talking about how God overrules parts of our lives. We think that we know how to make decisions and that we have some kind of idea what's best for our lives, but God says, overruled. We have resentments about past hurts that we just can't let go of, and we say that we can't forgive ourselves, but God says, overruled. I've already forgiven you through my son, Jesus. We say that our story is already written and that we've screwed it up too badly, but God says, overruled. He says, there's no part of your story that I cannot redeem. And then there's this whole forgiveness thing. And the minute I said that word, the minute that comes out of my mouth, half of you want to get up and go out the door. Am I right? Am I right about that? Because there are people in this room who have a boatload of things that have happened to them, bad things. And then there are people in this room who have done a boatload of bad things to other people. So I want to tell you a quick story about forgiveness. There was a woman, and she had a parrot for a pet. And all that parrot did was treat her bad. It insulted her day in and day out, and every time she tried to pick it up, it would peck at her. And so one day she got fed up with that parrot as it was insulting her, and she picked it up, it pecked her arm, and it said, "You are so ugly, I cannot stand you." And so the woman had had enough. She opened her freezer door and she threw the parrot in and she closed the door. And from inside the freezer, it was very, very quiet. And for about 5 seconds, she thought, man, what have I done? I've killed my parrot. What have I done? And so she opened up the door. And she sees that the parrot's just sort of sitting there looking at her, looking stunned. And so she picked it up, and the parrot says, "I am so very sorry. I apologize for my bad behavior, and I promise you there will be no more of that. From now on, I will be a respectful, obedient parrot." "Well, okay, apology accepted," she says. The parrot said, "Thank you." And then he said, "There's just one thing I want to know." And she said, "Yeah, what's that?" And the parrot looked back at the freezer and said, "What did the chicken do?" A story about forgiveness. Let's be real honest though tonight, okay? Forgiveness and making amends is just hard. The 8th step isn't too bad. See, I can make a list of people that I've harmed all day long, and then comes that 9th step. And I have the challenge of taking that list and actually righting the wrongs that I've done. That's so painful. Because a lot of the wrong that I've done involves my inability to forgive. And before I can authentically ask for forgiveness, I have to forgive. Now, I may not have stolen money from anybody, but I sure have harbored resentments and withheld love from people that I was supposed to love. That's kind of stealing, isn't it? I may not have killed anybody, but I sure have wished some people dead for what they've done to me. I may not have enacted revenge against somebody who hurt me, but I sure have withheld forgiveness in my tight little hands because they didn't deserve it, or because they didn't ask for forgiveness. I have held on to my anger like a tiger cub, and I've stroked it, and I've fed it, and I've petted it, and I've made it my best friend because, by God, I was right and they were wrong. And then the tiger grew, and it began to bite and scratch, and it threatened to devour me. Because, see, the deal is we are all wounded people. It's not just us. Not just us here in this room, but it's everybody in the world. There's no one who is not caught up in a cycle of woundedness of some kind. You hurt me, I hurt you back. I hurt somebody else who hurts somebody else. My 3-year-old grandson has been getting in trouble at school lately, at preschool. So I went to pick him up one Friday afternoon, as I sometimes do. And he had that day bitten another child and gotten written up for it, got a note sent home. And that's a really serious offense when you're in preschool. So as we were walking to the car, I say to him, hey, our teeth are for biting our food. Our teeth are not for biting people. And he just looked at me and he said, Grandma, he was pounding me and pounding me. The cycle of woundedness starts very early. It's been going on since the beginning of time. It started out with Cain and Abel, the son of Adam and Eve. They were fresh out of the Garden of Eden. And they were actually fighting over who was presenting the best offering to God. They were fighting over worship of all things. And so Cain killed Abel. And so Cain's punishment was to be a homeless wanderer for the rest of his life. Then there's this other biblical story of wounding. It's the story of Hagar. A lot of people have never even heard her story or know who she is. But she became a slave to Sarah when Sarah and Abraham were in Egypt. There was a famine in their country, and so they had gone to Egypt to get food. And Abraham one day noticed the Pharaoh walking around looking at his wife Sarah. And he realized he needed to kind of hide the fact that he and Sarah were married because Pharaoh really wanted Sarah. So he says to Pharaoh, well, she's my sister. You can have her. And so Pharaoh actually married Sarah. Abraham wounded his own wife in that way. So Pharaoh eventually found out that he had married a woman who was already married, and so he sent Sarah away. But meanwhile, he gave her a slave named Hagar to go home with her. Hagar had to leave the only home she had ever known. She was wounded. God promised Abraham that he would have as many descendants as the stars in the sky or the grains of sand on the earth. But Sarah was barren and she didn't produce any children, and she had this huge burden of shame because of that. She was wounded. Because see, in her culture, if you were barren, if you had no children, it meant that you had sinned in some way, and you would be shamed and you would be shunned. So instead of waiting on God to fulfill his promise of this large family, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. And she gave her slave Hagar to Abraham to sleep with in hopes that a child would be born through her. She was wounded. So Hagar became pregnant and started lording it over Sarah. Ha ha ha, I'm pregnant and you're not. And it's your husband's child. She was wounded. Sarah abused Hagar, and Hagar decided to run away, but an angel sent her back, and she had a child named Ishmael. She was wounded. There's so much wounding in that story as it continues that it would seem impossible to unravel all of it. And then finally, at the age of 90, get this, 90, Sarah has the promised son, Isaac. Abraham was 99. So guys, there's always hope. I guess. But by this time, Ishmael, the first child, was a young teenager, and so he started being mean to the young baby Isaac. He wounded him. So Sarah got furious and sent Hagar and Ishmael into the desert to die. Wounded. And so this cycle of pain went on and on and on until an angel rescued Hagar and Ishmael in the desert. and promised that Ishmael would also have a large family and be the father of great nations, and he was. It was from Ishmael that the Arab nations are descended. And so the cycle of pain is still with us, because the Jewish state of Israel still fights with its Arab neighbors with all this repeated physical and emotional and political and psychological wounding. The wound can divide, and it can multiply as though it's a living cell until entire families take sides and fight and sue, and they don't speak to each other. Where have you heard that story this week? Does that sound like the story out of Union County this week? These two families who tortured each other, both thinking that they were justified, until one of them is now dead. Now, what would have happened, do you think, in either of those three stories? The story of Cain and Abel, the story of Sarah and Hagar, or the story of Woodby and Wagner? What would have happened if any of them would have just said, "I'm sorry"? What would have happened if any of them had just asked for forgiveness instead of being bitter and contemptuous? It's been said that harboring bitterness is like drinking poison and then expecting the other person to get sick. And we do that all the time, don't we? There's even a show on TV called Revenge. Anybody know that show? Some people love that show. What do you think the show Revenge is about? What do you think it's about? It's about revenge. How many of us have wounded others? Could the cycle end if you were willing to give in and apologize and make amends? Do the sort of ninth step kind of thing? See, the answer to that is yes. Is it as easy as all that? No. Because if it were easy, we would have all done it by now. But the truth is, we can ask for forgiveness from others, but we're not responsible for their willingness to do it. But what we are responsible for is for forgiving those who have wounded us, whether they asked for forgiveness or not. See, our usual path is to begin with payback. We think we'll forgive when the other person asks for it, and when that other person has suffered enough. I like that, don't you? Because we want to grind that worm under our boot until it knows how we feel. And at that point, you want the other, the perpetrator, to feel pain. It's way fun to play the victim, because that somehow makes you in the right. But are you in the right if you're harboring hatred and resentment? Are you in the right if you're plotting revenge and trying to ruin the reputation of the person who's harmed you? I was mentally, physically, and verbally abused. And for a while, I just wanted everybody to know it. I wanted to crush that worm. But let's say that we understand that payback is not the answer. Let's assume that we know that anger and resentment and bitterness will kill us. The big book, page 64, says, resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics, and in parenthesis I would say, and everyone else, than anything else. And that's because resentment creates all kinds of spiritual disease, because from it we can become physically and mentally sick. There's a guy named Lewis Smedes, and he's written a book called The Art of Forgiving. It's a great, groundbreaking book, and he says, the most creative power given to the human spirit is the power to heal the wounds of a past it cannot change. I want to say it again. The most creative power given to the human spirit is the power to heal the wounds of a past it cannot change. The only one who gives that power is the one who created us. And when we're harmed, in chapter 5 of our story, when we write chapter 6, it will be a different story because of what happened in chapter 5, because of that woundedness. And we can't change that. But as we learned last week, God can and does overrule the past of our story and gives power to change the ultimate outcome. And Smead says that forgiving happens in 3 stages. You can write these down. Number 1, we rediscover the humanity of the person who wronged us. As I said a minute ago, I was abused mentally, physically, and verbally in a bad way. Now, I knew that the churchy answer for that was that Jesus said I was supposed to forgive 70 times 7. And I totally misunderstood what Jesus meant by that, because Jesus meant we can forgive perfectly inside our hearts and minds. He did not say that we were supposed to keep going back and staying in a relationship with that perpetrator. So every time the perpetrator said he was sorry, I tried again to make the marriage work. And I stayed the victim as much as it hurt. But by staying the victim, I very nearly died. Mentally, physically, and emotionally. But with God's help and with the help of others, I did get out. So if you're being abused, you must get out. There is no other answer. But in order to get free, I had to keep not wanting revenge and begin to let go of being the victim. See, I was actually told by another pastor that as long as the abuser didn't ask for forgiveness, I wasn't obliged to give it. And I held on to that for a while, but it was eating me alive. I was walking in the shadow of fear all the time. And I had to make a decision. Would I stay with the anger and fear, or would I go with God? And I couldn't work it out with my abuser because that was neither possible nor smart. So I began doing exactly what Smead says. Rather than continue to demonize my abuser, I had to rediscover his humanity. And one day I was praying about how to do that, and I remembered a story that he had told me. It was a story about his own father. His own father was an alcoholic. And his own father had consistently abused his mother when he was drunk. And so one day his father came into the house with a gun and he shot holes into the ceiling to prove his power over her. But while all this was going on, there was this little boy child, and he hid behind a chair and he cried. He was just a little kid. His heart was broken. And he was afraid. And so as I prayed for God to help me forgive, that very story came to my mind, and I was able to actually see again this story unfold in my mind. And as I did, I cried, and my heart was broken again for him. Did that excuse him from repeating the story with me as the victim? No, not at all. But for me, it was like a shower, and that memory was completely washed away from me, and the anger was cleaned from me. I rediscovered his humanity. Smead says that the second thing we do is surrender our right to get even. We give it up because we start to understand that God and not we are in charge of that person's life. Waiting for somebody to repent before we forgive is to surrender our future to the one who wronged us, and we don't want to surrender our future to the one who wronged us. Because God is way, way big enough to overrule that person's power over us. There's a story of Joseph in the Old Testament. And he was the one, you'll remember, who was the favored child of his father Jacob. Jacob told his 11 brothers that he had a dream where they would all bow down to him. That was smart, wasn't it? His siblings were jealous enough that they wanted to kill him. And can you blame them? So they sold him off into slavery to some Egyptian traders. But God, see, overruled their plan for his demise. Because God, over a period of years, elevated Joseph to a very high status in Egypt in terms of power. Joseph was right up there next to the Pharaoh. And years later, Joseph's brothers were forced to go to Egypt because, again, there was a famine in Canaan. And so they had to go to Joseph and beg for food, but they didn't know it was Joseph. They didn't recognize him because they hadn't seen him for years, and they really did think he was dead. He hadn't tweeted them about his high position. So when they bowed down before this high official, they had no idea that this was Joseph's dream fulfilled. And when he realized that he was their brother, they were afraid, and they said, "We're your slaves, forgive us, forgive us." But Joseph had no need for revenge. The Bible quotes him as saying, "You intended to harm me, but God used it for good to accomplish what's being done in the saving of many lives." See, Joseph could have cut them all down, but he gave up his right to get even. Smead says that the third stage is simply, we wish that person well. When we forgive, we set a prisoner free, and we discover that the prisoner we set free is us. Forgiveness is a gift to ourselves, and we are at peace. By wishing them well, it does not mean that we tolerate what they have done to hurt us. It does not mean staying in relationship with that person. It simply means that we have no need to see them suffer any longer. Does it mean that we forget it? No, that's impossible. But we're able to let it go, and we refuse to let it rent space in our head any longer. You know, over the past few weeks, I've been enjoying this graphic on the screen. I love the silhouette of that dad and the baby that's on the screen. Because the way I interpret that, the dad is getting ready to plant a kiss on this baby's little smooshy cheek. And all of you who have done that know what that feels like. You know how that baby smells. You know how warm their little bodies are, how they cuddle in when you love on them. And then I have a picture of my dad holding me when I was a newborn. I can see the love on his face. I can see that he is so proud of me and that he wants to protect me forever. He thinks I'm perfect. On my wedding day, he was the only one crying. And he had that same look on his face. When I was 16, I had this run-in with my mom over something really, really stupid. And the two of us refused to speak for about a week or so because I was never going to forgive her. My dad finally had enough of all that, and so he came to me, and I thought I was about to really get it. Because in my mind, he had sided with my mom, and I was about to get a tongue lashing about my stubbornness and my failure to forgive. So I got ready, and I had my defenses all built up. But I can remember it like it was yesterday. I was sitting on my bed, and he walked into my room, and he sat in the chair across from the bed. And he just looked me right straight in the eye, and he said, "Rebecca, you know how much I love you." And that's all it took. I dissolved into tears right there. I melted into a puddle. Because, see, he forgave me even when I couldn't forgive. He loved me when I failed to love. And he looked at me with that same look as when I was born. My daddy's 92 now, and he still looks at me like that. Because he loved me, I was able to go to my mom the next day and make amends. And see, your daddy in heaven, he looks at you just like that. He says, look at that child of mine. Isn't he perfect? Doesn't she have a beautiful heart? And he's head over heels in love with you. So much so that he sent his son so that you could be perfectly forgiven. Because your daddy in heaven can love you into forgiving even when you think it's unforgivable. If you ask your heavenly dad to help you, he will. He can overrule that cycle of pain, and he can help you take the steps to becoming free from the sin of unforgiveness. You know, it may take a lifetime to forgive yourself and others and to make amends, because it's kind of sometimes like a snake crawling on the ground, and you shoot that snake and you think it's dead. The next thing you know, it's still wiggling around. You have to shoot it again. And sometimes you have to shoot it again. But the promises of the ninth step are that we will know a new freedom and a new happiness, that we'll know peace, and that our whole attitude and outlook on life will change. And friends, it can start tonight. Because if you will allow God to overrule your pain and begin a new work in you, if you will let God overrule your resistance to forgive, you can have freedom. Don't wait any longer. Let's let it begin tonight. Let's let it begin right here at this altar. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.